Oh, misty eye of the mountain below, keep careful misty watch of my brother's souls. And should the sky be filled with fire and smoke, keep watching over during suns. If this is to end in fire, then we shall all burn together. Watch the flames climb high into the night, calling out, Father, oh, stand by and we will watch the flames burn open on the mountainside. And if we should die tonight, we should all die together. Raise a glass of wine for the last time, calling out, Father, oh, prepare as we will watch the flames burn open on the mountainside. Desolation comes upon the sky. Inside the mountain I see fire, burning the trees, and I see fire, hollow in soul, I see fire, blood in the breeze, and I hope that you remember me. Beating will fold, and surely I'll do the same. Confined in mountain holes, we got too close to the flame, calling out, Father, oh, hold fast and we will watch the flames burn open on the mountainside. Desolation comes upon the sky. I see fire inside the mountain. I see fire burning the trees. I see fire hollow in soul. I see fire, blood in the breeze, and I hope that you remember me. And if the night is burning, I will cover my eyes. For if the dark returns, then my brothers will die. And as the sky is falling down, it crashed into this lonely town. And with that shadow upon the ground, I hear my people screaming out. And I see fire inside the mountains. I see fire burning the trees. I see fire hollow in souls. I see fire, blood in the breeze. I see fire. Oh, you know I saw a city burn out, and I see fire.
All right, everyone. I wanted to start today just testing the audio, but if you're having trouble hearing me, it is because for some reason the headphone jack does not work on this computer, so I apologize. We are going to talk a little bit about the Ukraine issue today, but there's certainly other stuff happening in the news that I think could be more important. And I think the biggest issue, which is something that I've been reading about more lately, is pending the pending economic crisis that I think we're already seeing the beginning of it, but it is tied to what's happening in Ukraine because of America's energy policy, right? So what many Americans don't realize is that America's policies overseas are not necessarily only an issue of force and geopolitics and strategy, but also of economic strategy. And what has happened since the beginning of the year, and even way before that, is that we've squandered a lot of the advantage and basically have become a country that's in the state where we have to hold our hands out to other countries around the world and ask them for help in order to meet our energy needs. And a sign of weakness does not go without a reaction. So this I believe is one major issue that I want to dedicate some time to today. What's going on with the petrodollar will probably affect the welfare and life of every American in the near future and potentially lead to a sort of economic meltdown, the likes of which our generation hasn't seen, maybe hasn't happened in American history yet. And it's something that I have talked privately with people I know about a lot. And I don't think people are really processing what that means. It means basically that the things that we have taken for granted, the availability of goods, the ease of transportation, the career mobility, everything that we have come to accept is basically part of the American way of life, is threatened by the fall of the petrodollar, which in many cases was going to happen at some point anyway. But really, sometimes the question is not what has to happen, but how you prepare for it. And the American government has done very little to prepare Americans for this eventuality, because that would mean acknowledging that they have taken us into a very dangerous area and they don't know how to get us out. Now, we are going to start, though, and do a little bit of Ukraine analysis. And this is a website that does a lot of live tracking here. Let me zoom out a little. And this is the way that they portray it. I don't know if it's exactly the most accurate in terms of zones of control, but it isn't very different from some of the other maps that I've seen. And it shows that Russian armies have started to control, parts of Ukraine where they seem to be advancing slowly and potentially could overwhelm the Ukrainian forces in the east. If you want, there's a bit of advice if you don't think that you can rely on me or you can't rely on the media. I do want you to check out the Duran. They're a channel on, they are on Odyssey, for example, and I think they're also on BitChute. They provide, I think, an alternative view of what's happening over there. And I would say that, I'm being charitable, they are more sympathetic to Russia than almost any other news source that I get. But they provide news bulletins and updates that I don't think you would generally hear on American media. And I don't think it's because they're making it up. I think it's because there are certain events that happen in American foreign policy that the American media doesn't really want to make a big deal about, because it would highlight certain crises that they're not prepared to talk about. And one issue that they were talking about today was this encirclement of Ukrainian forces in Mariupol. Okay, Mariupol is located down here and it is basically isolated from the rest of Ukraine by besieging Russian forces. So while the line of control here doesn't seem to be entirely cut off, you can see the roads are cut off. You can see that the Russians basically have them bottled up in Mariupol. And according to the Duran, it was about 14,000 troops of the Ukrainian forces are bottled up there. Now, you might say, why is that such a big deal? Okay. You have to remember that the people that the Ukrainian forces that were on the eastern side of this conflict in Donbass, in the two regions of Lugansk and Donetsk, they are the tip of the spear of the Ukrainian effort since 2014 to prevent Russian separatists from basically wresting those two regions away and delivering them to Russia. If they are surrounded and cut off from the rest of the Ukrainian forces, that is a major defeat. And potentially, if they surrender and the Russians are able to assert control over Mariupol, well, they can dedicate forces elsewhere. There is another encirclement, according to the Duran, happening in this area. If I can find it. So over the border, there's an area called Severodonetsk, which I think means North Donetsk. That is an area where if the Russians are able to perform an encirclement that cuts off those forces, that's another tens of thousands of Ukrainian forces that will be basically cut off. So there are people cut off over here. You have an encirclement over in the main conflict area that's not in the east, over here in Chernihiv. I think it's Chernigiv. I don't remember how to pronounce it. I don't have great Russian or Ukrainian skills. I can basically read it. So, but you do see that there are encirclements where Ukrainian forces are cut off from the main group. And once those forces are cut off, then the Russians can maneuver around them and sort of keeps Ukrainian supply lines from getting provisions to the front, and then they choke off the Ukrainian troops that are at the front, and then gradually they close in more on Kiev. Kiev right now, if you look at this map, it is you can supply it from the south. Apparently the Russians have made some sort of, according to this map at least, some sort of bridgehead there. I don't know if that's really what that map is meant to represent, but you are talking about a Russian effort that is definitely gaining some ground and endangering the Ukrainian government in the larger war effort. Now, there have been some setbacks, and I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's gone smoothly for Russia or that Ukraine has, you have to take with a grain of salt both sides. The Russians think that they can just say, well, everything's going according to schedule and this is going to work. Well, obviously things have not gone according to schedule if there have been setbacks that have been documented, right? There have been aircraft that have been lost, armored vehicles that have been lost, transport vehicles that have been lost, soldiers and officers that have been lost that maybe the Russians didn't anticipate. On the other hand, you see a lot of these Ukrainian press releases that talk about generals being killed, about pilots that are shot down and captured after their planes are basically taken out by anti-aircraft fire or by AA missiles. And the Ukrainians are heralding every one of these incidents, or I guess series of incidents, as some sort of major victory against the Russian war machine. Now, I think it's admirable that a smaller country with a less, a less capable military has been able to mount such a defense against an aggressive neighbor that might have thought that it could just waltz into the capital unabated. But nevertheless, I do think, and I'll continue to think, that Ukraine has already lost the war. They've lost the war in a number of respects, but the most important respects are in terms of civilian infrastructure being destroyed, military infrastructure being degraded, notwithstanding American promises that they're going to. Today, I believe that they approved another extra $500 million of military hardware to Ukraine from the Biden administration, and I think Congress approved it. And I think over the weekend, or just in the past couple of days, there were two bills or so, or rather, it was the major omnibus bill that had, I think, $13 billion going to Ukraine. So the United States is basically throwing money at a problem that they can't really, they can't really solve, right? What's going on in Ukraine cannot be solved simply by throwing money at it, because if it could be solved that way, what happened to all of the monies that were already sent to them over the past 8 years, whether it was the civil funding that the Obama administration delivered to them, non-lethal military aid, I think was also on it, or the actual military aid that Donald Trump approved to go to Ukraine at the time. That was all, I believe, meant to be a deterrent against Russian invasion, meaning that maybe it wouldn't send the message that Russia would fail to defeat Ukraine, but that it would be sufficiently painful and costly for the Russians to invade that they wouldn't try to do it. Well, evidently that didn't work, right? Because the Russians are in Ukraine and they are occupying parts of Ukraine, and it is working. Now, there are a lot of people who are trying to, basically front for the Ukrainian government and say, Vladimir Zelensky is doing his utmost in order to safeguard the Ukrainian people and keep them alive, and we need to get behind him and support him, because at this moment in history, he is somebody who is, he is basically carrying the hope of the Western world on his back in order to fight against these Russian hordes. And I've heard people online talk about it this way. I've heard people in the media talk about it this way. I've heard people accuse Tucker Carlson and Tulsi Gabbard of being disloyal for feeling a little bit differently. Tulsi Gabbard, in fact, also pointed out that all this talk about Zelensky being a Democratic leader isn't really accurate, because under Zelensky, the Ukrainian government has they've gone and forced a lot of the opposition media, opposition candidates, underground, or arrested them, put them under house arrest, because many of them are pro-Russian, right? And there is a tendency within Ukraine. It's certainly smaller than it used to be, because nobody likes to be invaded. But there's always been a tendency within Ukraine of Russian-speaking Eastern Ukrainians who want to say that they belong more in the Russian sphere of influence than they do over in the Western, the European sphere of influence. And so therefore, the people who have transformed Volodymyr Zelensky into the Winston Churchill of Ukraine, or the George Washington of Ukraine, or any of these other patriotic figures from other countries, need to understand that it's not accurate. He is basically leading his country to doom. And I don't think it's entirely his fault. I think that he may have tried to avoid this. I think he's had bad advice. I think he's had bad friends, and he's had bad decisions that he's made. The biggest decision I think he should have made when Vladimir Zelensky started his term as president was to go to Russia and essentially say, you know what, it's time to, end this standoff over eastern Ukraine. We will commit to being a neutral country, You can trust us just like other neutral countries that have been in the past, like Finland. This by the way was an offer that was put on the table today. The Russians said, if you become like Finland and you commit to non-alignment, neutrality in all matters between the European Union and Russia, this is a term that we will accept, but it has to be within your constitution. It has to be within, and you also have to sign treaties. And these are all elements of Russian policy that I think it might not be convenient for Ukraine to sign any agreement like that, but it's the way of the world. Unfortunately, Ukraine is not in a position that where it can just dictate its own terms and say, well, we piss off, we don't care what you think. They have lost certain strategic territory that if you really are looking at this with a clear head, it's not just about territory, it's about transportation, and it's about the civilian infrastructure of Ukraine. And you do see that the Russians are basically gobbling up areas of Ukraine that they think are useful. I don't know if they'll ever get to the point where they will, specifically invade and conquer Odessa, which is the larger seaport on Ukraine's Black Sea coast. But at this point, it doesn't necessarily matter, because even if they don't invade and take Odessa, which there have been rumblings that they ought to do that in the next few days. Even if they don't actually do it, Odessa is blockaded. The Russians have control of the Black Sea coast, and the Ukrainians have to transport everything over land. And when you transport things over land, the Soviets can also decide to bomb some of these road networks. They don't have to send necessarily planes. They can send what are called surface to surface missiles, right? Like the Scud missile. That's a missile that was very well known in the 90s because the Iraqis were using them against their neighbors, against Saudi Arabia, against Israel. And those Scud missiles and other armaments that they have can basically knock out the road network of Ukraine and the railroads and render it completely isolated, right? So this is just talking about war strategy in a larger sense when you're fighting between nation and nation. The Russians, I think, would be very foolish to continue and try to occupy all of Ukraine and dominate it and keep it entirely under their thumb. Why? Because it is easy to control sectors and areas of a country using roadways, using transportation networks, using waterways. That is a good way to control a nation in the larger sense, but at the micro level, each community, each area, you do have to deal with individual neighborhoods and communities, and if those communities get organized and start to resist and wear down the Russians, it's much harder for them to react to it because they have to divide all of their efforts in so many different areas. So I don't think it's a wise idea, and I don't think it's really Vladimir Putin's plan to put Russian soldiers all over Ukraine's interior, because I don't think it'll work. And I don't think he's foolish enough to do it. But I do think that he will try to organize parts of eastern Ukraine, as he already has with the Donbass region, into pro-Russian puppet states, the way he has in Georgia. He's had two puppet states over there. He's had a puppet state in Moldova. He has a puppet state over in what's that other country? He has in Moldova. So that's called Transnistria, and he has the two Ukrainian puppet republics, and I guess he has Crimea if you want to count that. And also he has countries that are basically sovereign nations that are really under his thumb, like Belarus. Okay, so Belarus would be under his thumb. I think to some degree Armenia is a very close ally of Putin, though I wouldn't say that Armenia is his pawn. and they haven't really shown any support during this war. But there are countries that have always been sympathetic to Putin because they realize that he can afford them some sort of strategic aid against their neighbors, right? Armenia has a conflict with Azerbaijan over a region that is disputed between them. And therefore, they are able to use this in order to, they're able to use Russian aid in order to get an advantage. 1 second. My wife's home. I just need to tell her that I am on stream. Anyway, so that's what I have to say about Ukraine. And what I would remind people is that you can put all the hashtags, you can put all the Ukraine flag emojis. That's not going to win the war for them. Unfortunately, it is armies that win wars, and the Ukrainian army is not big enough and not equipped well enough in order to defeat the Russians. Let's see here. So you will see, in my opinion, hey, look, the map moved all the way to Philadelphia. Isn't that interesting? So I must have clicked on something wrong. So that's with regards to Ukraine. And I think that once the war is concluded, you'll probably see that Zelensky will have to go ahead and say, I'm sorry, but I will agree to those terms. Even here you can see Russian equipment is being prepared for railway movement in Abkhazia. Abkhazia is one of the public republics of the area of Georgia. So there's 2 republics in Georgia that are pro-Russian. So all they have to do is move troops between here and Crimea, and they can basically keep resupplying the troops in southern Ukraine. And I think that as the war wears on, you're going to see less ability of the Ukrainians to fend off Russian assaults because many of these troops are isolated. You have the ones in eastern Ukraine I already went over earlier. Now let's shift over to the issue of the petrodollar. Since 1971, the U.S. has had an arrangement with Saudi Arabia and with other OPEC member states where they only receive payment in dollars. And that's been a big support network for the dollar as the reserve currency of the world economy. And there's been a lot of worry for many years. What would happen if another country would come forward and say, well, we don't necessarily want to accept payment in dollars, or another country would say, well, we don't really want to pay for any of our oil using the dollar. We're going to use the euro. Okay, that's what happened with Iraq. Well, you know what happened in the end. Iraq was invaded in 2003 and overthrown, and their oil sales went back to the dollar because they didn't have any way to safeguard their territory. They didn't have any deterrent, I should say, from invasion, and the U.S. ended up invading them. And whether you agree with the war or didn't, it did save the petrodollar, at least with regards to Iraq. I think most people who are sane now realize that the Iraq war was a tremendous failure and and was based on lies and misinformation, and the same type of disinformation used right now in order to really get Americans ginned up about Russia, which is a much more dangerous situation. The reason it's a more dangerous situation is very simple, because Russia has nuclear weapons, and regardless of whether the invasion of Ukraine is legitimate or not, I don't think you can make a case that it was a legitimate reason to invade, because Ukraine was not invading or encroaching on any Russian territory. But I think the Russians know that the American government cannot risk nuclear war in order to defend the frontiers of Ukraine. That's why a lot of this talk I've been classifying as demagoguery with regards to, that Zelensky is this brave leader, and we must all get behind him, and we have to do everything we can and send him all the money and all the resources and all the tanks and equipment and aircraft. That is demagoguery. It's demagoguery on his part. It's on the part of the people who support him, the Sean Hannitys and the Joe Scarboroughs, and who's the other guy from CNN, Don Lemon. All of them are demagogues, because it's not really based on reason. We cannot prevent the Russian government from actually asserting its needs in Ukraine without risking nuclear war through providing a no-fly zone. That's something that actually Zelensky called for today, while he was in the full knowledge that Ukraine is not really in the position to ask for one, right? They're in the position because they're under threat of being overwhelmed. Why are they under the threat of being overwhelmed? Because the international community, the nations of the European Union and NATO and the United States have all put them at risk, such that they're now being destroyed by Russia. And we're basically, fighting Russia down to the last Ukrainian, right? So all these many of them are brave people. They know that their homeland is at risk of totally being dominated and subjugated by an enemy power. And yet they are begging Americans and begging people from all over Europe and the Western world to send troops, to send tanks, to send aircraft, to put a no-fly zone, foreign volunteers, all of that jazz. They're telling them to come in order to save Ukraine, when they all have the knowledge that that's not going to actually happen. What will have to happen is that Zelensky will have to come to a settlement with Putin, or they'll be grinded down, and basically Ukraine will fall. Either Kiev will fall, or it will be encircled, and there will be some sort of long, drawn-out siege. And in any case, you're not seeing a positive outcome for the Ukrainians, because they can't really evict the Russians from Ukrainian land. They're too firmly established at this point. Losing Crimea to begin with was a terrible loss for the Ukrainians, because Crimea is an excellent defensive area, or area both to defend the Black Sea on the Russians' part, and to launch an offensive into the rest of Ukraine. And that's exactly what they did. And that's why I think you see much of the progress, the best progress for the Russians, is from Crimea. And the Ukrainians can't really. I mean, you can put all that rhetoric out. You can request all this help. You can get that help, and it's not going to change the fact that there is a lot that the Ukrainians have already lost, and to a certain extent, the war itself they have already lost. And this map is actually being very conservative, because it's only talking about areas that are directly under Russian troop control. Forget about the fact that there are areas that the Ukrainians have already abandoned. Simply, the Russians don't have troops to cover it. So I am going to basically call this as something that's just waiting to happen. Yes, the Ukrainians are going to continue to resist, and the Russians are going to continue to advance. The Saudi Arabian government has, for many, many years, been a good linchpin in the scheme of the world economy in terms of keeping the petrodollar alive, right? Now, because Russia and China are on the other side of this conflict in terms of Ukraine and in terms of the Pacific, we are seeing an alternative reserve currency beginning to emerge, which would be the yuan. And the yuan, if it is adopted as a petro currency for the Saudi Arabians, would essentially dethrone the United States as the premier economic power in the world, meaning that everything, when you take a dollar out of your pocket, if you're an American, I don't know where Chris is from, I think he might be from Southeast Asia, but let's say you take a dollar out of your pocket and you want to buy something anywhere in the world, it does have a certain strength as a currency because it's accepted so many places and because so many different transactions take place around the world. And there are certain transactions, the most important being oil, that are only denominated in dollars. Therefore, up until now, when a nation wanted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they would have to put it in dollars, right? They would have to take their money, whether it was in yen or in euros or whatever, and buy dollars and then pay the country that is the oil producer in dollars. Well, if those countries start to say, well, you know what, it's not that important, we'll just take the yuan too. That is a major failure on the part of the dollar system, right? Because the Saudis will turn around and use the dollar usually in order to buy other stuff. Well, if they're getting yuans now, and if the UAE starts to accept yuans, and you already have, I believe, Iran accepting payment in yuans, all of those, all those transactions that would be in dollars never actually happen. And the dollars in circulation, often of which are not even physically existent, they're simply, digits in a data, they're simply files in a database, right? Because the Federal Reserve can just print as much money as it wants and doesn't have to physically print it. They just appear on balance sheets. So those dollars are basically not even being used. And when there's an excess of currency, and there's not that many goods, I mean, there's not that many goods, but there's a lot of currency chasing it. What do you get? You get inflation. So we already have inflation. This is going to make the inflation worse, possibly much worse. And this, I think, is the bigger problem, unfortunately, than Ukraine for Americans. And I say this, lamentably. I think obviously it's a tragedy whenever a country gets invaded and gets plundered and destroyed. This has happened in Libya. This has happened in Iraq. It's happened in countries that Russia has aggressed against, such as Afghanistan in the past, which we aggressed. I mean, we invaded Afghanistan after 9/11 too. Did I mention Georgia already? And war is obviously a terrible reality that in some countries people just adapt to, and that's just a sad fact. But the decline of the petrodollar for Americans, I think, will have more of an impact culturally and in terms of their daily reality than many of these wars have had. The wars that we've already been a part of, because those have happened overseas, right? The decline of the petrodollar and the economic crisis that it could precipitate, if you think about it, it could increase the price of goods all across the board. I mean, we've already been seeing people having to pay more for, just food and basic amenities, appliances, things like that. So, and certainly cars. That started much earlier. So all I'm saying here is that don't believe in the demagoguery of the people who say, well, you're not being patriotic if you're not standing with Ukraine. You're only ignoring the human suffering, and you're making you're putting money ahead of human lives and everything. The fact is that what happened in Ukraine happened because of the decisions of the people in the government. And they have already screwed it up so poorly that they can't actually find a way out of the crisis. That's how the war happened. If there would have been the right type of posturing, the right type of diplomacy, and certainly some sort of trade agreement with Russia that would have averted this crisis, and some sort of arrangement, then we wouldn't be in the middle of it. So instead, they're moving the blame, they're shifting the blame to their critics over the failure that they created. So they're criticizing Tucker Carlson, they're criticizing anybody who is, just a regular citizen who's being skeptical of what's happening in Ukraine. That's who they're saying is the real traitor, because they're saying, well, are you so are you so selfish that you won't pay more for gas, you won't pay more for vegetables or laundry detergent because you don't care about the suffering of the people in Ukraine? That's the type of moralizing and emotional blackmail that they're perpetuating on the American people, and it is demagoguery. And ultimately, when Zelensky he's going to have to face the music. He's already facing the music. He's acknowledged that there probably won't be NATO membership for Ukraine. Basically, he's admitted it. He is begging for a no-fly zone. He knows he can't get it because none of the NATO member states are willing to do it. It would take America a few days to get it in place anyway. And instead, the Americans are saying, well, we're just going to send you all this equipment that you can use in order to fight off the Russians. Well, he can get all the equipment he wants, but you need soldiers and sailors and airmen in order to use those weapons, and that's what he's also running out of. That's why they're asking for more foreign volunteers, and that ultimately, I think, will be the defeat in Ukraine. That the U.S. has basically funded Ukraine as some sort of proxy enemy of Russia, and the Russians finally saw the opportunity to put an end to it, and the Americans weren't really ready to back up their boy, the Ukrainian government, Zelensky. They won't back them up because they can't, and the Russians have called the bluff, and that's it. But you will be feeling the effects, and I will be feeling the effects of all the economic damage that this has done for many years to come. I will say, if you want a different perspective on this, one that's not mine. This is from Dennis Prager. I used to listen to him a little bit on the radio. I'm not a fan of his, but I certainly, enjoy his take sometimes. So that's something from American Greatness, which I write for sometimes. And he tries to make a point that, yes, it is for America's interest to look out for Ukraine. And he says that you can't really go and justify what Russia has done simply by talking about NATO encroachment and everything, because on its face, Russia invaded in the end. It's not as if Russia was invaded by NATO and they're reacting to it. Russia was the proactive aggressor, and there was no hint of Ukraine ever invading Russia itself. In fact, part of Ukraine is trying to separate and join Russia, which you could say is more of a problem that Ukraine should be pissed off about than Russia. But yeah, this is definitely, it's a situation that's not black and white, but you could certainly say that the media is manipulating the situation in order to make you feel guilty. So that's about it. Please like, share, and subscribe. I will take your comments if you want to put them in the description. This will be uploaded to BitChute, Rumble, and Odyssey sometime later today if you want to watch it there. And have a great day, and I hope next time this audio situation will be worked out. And peace.
Oh, misty eye of the mountain below, keep careful watch of my brother's souls. And should the sky be filled with fire and smoke, keep watching over during suns. If this is to end in fire, then we shall all burn together. Watch the flames climb high into the night, calling out, Father, oh, stand by and we will watch the flames burn open on the mountainside. And if we should die tonight, we should all die together. Raise a glass of wine for the last time, calling out, Father.
For those that didn't see it, or
Prepare as we will watch the flames burn open on the mountainside. Desolation comes upon the sky. Now I see fire inside the mountain. I see fire burning the trees, and I see fire hollow in soul. I see fire, blood in the breeze, and I hope that you remember me. Oh, should my people fold, and surely I'll do the same. Confined in mountain holes, we got too close to the flame, calling out, Father, oh, hold fast and we will watch the flames burn open on the mountainside. Desolation comes upon the sky. Now I see fire inside the mountain. I see fire